we present The Spirit of Kitty Hawk, a series to mark the 80th anniversary of powered flight, in which the story of some of the people who've made aviation history is told. Today, in the fourth of these programs, Ivan Rendell covers the Second World War, when pilots fought for superiority in the air.
The unmistakable sound of the Spitfire. In the 35 years since the Wright brothers had flown their fabric-covered biplane at Kitty Hawk, the shape and sound of aircraft had come a long way. In 1938, when the Spitfire came into service, it was the state-of-the-art in fighters and aerodynamic excellence, a sleek monoplane made of aluminium with a powerful Merlin engine. Pilots loved it.
The Spitfire is one of the most beautifully balanced aeroplanes ever felt in the hand. It's a pilot's delight.
And the Germans hated it.
Achtung, Achtung, Spitfire!
The Spitfire and the Hurricane were the backbone of RAF Fighter Command. They'd been developed from the racing seaplanes which won the Schneider Cup outright for Britain in the early 1930s. But they might never have been built had it not been for one man who understood what was needed and who was prepared to battle with the Air Ministry. That man was Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding.
The Air Ministry said, "Good, now come, we'll present another trophy and continue this international contest, rather like a Wimbledon tennis tournament, you see." And so I said, "Please not. We have spent some hundreds of thousands of pounds and 3 or 4 years in building the fastest seaplane in the world, and it is no good to us at all."
What Dowding was pressing for was a really fast monoplane fighter which could operate from grass airfields.
One of the people at the Air Ministry said, "We want to have biplanes." Well, I said, "Did you order biplanes when you were competing for the Schneider Trophy? You ordered monoplanes, didn't you?" I said, "Well, the same considerations hold here." And so they agreed to that, and they got in half a dozen drawings from the different firms, and we chose those of the Hurricane and the Spitfire.
Dowding laid another foundation for victory in the Battle of Britain when he organised the first demonstration and experiment with radar. Then in 1936 he was chosen to lead Fighter Command. On the surface he was an odd choice for such a dashing new post. He was the bane of civil servants, a rather retiring figure, softly spoken and known universally in the RAF by his nickname, Stuffy. But his strengths lay deeper, in qualities which Patrick Moore came to know well later.
A man with an immensely deep understanding of life, a man who knew where he was going, a man who knew what was right to do, and a man who was completely sincere and completely honest and couldn't have played a dirty trick if he'd tried. His personality was very far from being an aggressive personality. That was the last thing he was. I can only describe it as being quiet authority, because I shouldn't think he ever made a half statement in his life, and certainly never told an untruth.
Going back into the just before the war, I'm thinking now of the Schneider Cup and that sort of period, he did have an uncanny knack of being right about things. Was this sheer hard work, or was it just a tremendous intellectual power, do you think?
It was intellectual power. Of course, Lord Dowding, who was a spiritualist, made no secret of the fact that he regarded himself as being guided during the Battle of Britain. And certainly, some of the decisions he made may have looked wrong on the face of it, but everyone turned out to be right. So who's to say that he was wrong?
It was largely due to Dowding that the Battle of Britain was won in August and September 1940. In May that year, it was clear to him that France was finished, but the French government kept asking Britain to send over more fighters to stem the tide of the German blitzkrieg. Dowding was so fearful that the British government would send the aircraft over, and so convinced that it was the wrong thing to do, that he asked if he could address the entire War Cabinet. But there was, he knew, only one man he had to convince.
Well, I knew something about Churchill, and that was that he had a fondness for elementary mathematics. So I had equipped myself with a diagram, and I put this diagram down on that table, this graph, and I said, this is the state of affairs today, sir. This is the loss of hurricanes in the last 10 days. If that loss continues at the same rate, there won't be a single hurricane left in France or in England. And that did the trick, you see.
It was a momentous decision, but the leakage of fighters to France was stopped.
I was so afraid that he would change his mind that as soon as I got back, I wrote that letter to the Air Ministry. I never was very friendly with Churchill, you see, because he had been made to change his very stubborn mind in front of a room full of senior officers and officials in the country. He didn't like that. I don't want to say anything against Churchill, and I don't think he ever liked me very much after that, even if he had liked me before.
Now, Churchill would have been a pretty difficult man to convince of anything unless the facts are absolutely right.
Yes?
What was it about Lord Dowding that enabled him to convince Churchill, do you think, of the rightness of what he was saying?
Logic, for one thing, and I think his own personality. He was, I suppose, the most transparently honest man I've ever met. He had the whole situation well under control. He knew exactly what the reserves were. He knew where they were. He was able to tell Churchill exactly what the situation was. And Churchill, being Churchill, listened, which is extremely fortunate, because otherwise you and I wouldn't be sitting here.
Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the leader of the few, left Fighter Command just months after his victory, and a year later went into retirement. It's been thought by many that he was treated rather shabbily at the time, but after the war he showed no rancour and spent a happy retirement pursuing his interest in spiritualism. He died in 1970. One of the few who fought in the Battle of Britain, one of the young men whom Dowding led, was Flying Officer Richard Hillary. His book, The Last Enemy, is the classic account of the Battle of Britain, and is, to my mind, one of the best books to come out of the Second World War. Rather as Cecil Lewis did for the pilots of the First World War in Sagittarius Rising, Hillary wrote about the war in the air from the perspective of youth and from the pilot's seat. He was 20 when the war started, a member of the Oxford University Air Squadron, and according to his friends Pat Hollander and Bill Simpson, he had hardly a care in the world.
He was a golden youth. He was in a charmed situation, as they would say nowadays. He was at university when the war broke out. He was on the point of getting into the Vastic crew, rowing crew. And he was of a generation where, if there hadn't been a war, they could have expected it to have gone on in a kind of an Edwardian glow, kind of a glow of privilege and if you like, irresponsibility to some extent, and duty. Curious world. He was really rather an Edwardian character, I suppose, in some ways.
He had a naturally arrogant walk. His gestures were naturally arrogant. Everything he did was arrogant.
But with the advent of war, the carefree life came to an end, and Richard Hillary was soon on operational flying.
Well, you're scared beforehand, all right. You know, it's like the before-the-race feeling in rowing. And when you're going up before contact with the enemy, you feel rather queasy. But you get great satisfaction from seeing the other pilots. You look out and you see Bill on the right, John on the left, and so on. And he gives you a feeling of security. And then when the fight begins, you've no time to be afraid.
And in his own description of shooting down his first enemy aircraft, there's a youthful spirit of chivalry, so reminiscent of pilots of the First World War.
My first emotion was one of satisfaction. Satisfaction at a job at least adequately done. And then I had a feeling of the essential rightness of it all. He was dead, and I was alive. It could so easily have been the other way around, and that would somehow have been right too. I realized in that moment just how lucky a fighter pilot is. The fighter pilot's emotions are those of a duelist, cool, precise, impersonal. He is privileged to kill well. Death should be given the setting it deserves. It should never be a pettiness, and for the fighter pilot it never can be. I realized then that I had felt neither pity nor sorrow for that man. If I were to die, I asked nothing better than to go the same way.
In September 1940, at the height of the Battle of Britain, he was himself shot down.
I managed to get my sights on one plane quite close, I remember, and I gave him a short berth. At that moment, I had the stick knocked out of my hand because instead of breaking away, I'd hung on and tried to shoot him down. I was hit from dead astern by a cannon shell, and the whole machine just went straight up in flames. I remember trying to push the hood back, and then I don't remember anything until I found myself falling through the air. I pulled the ripcord of my parachute completely automatically, I suppose, and came down in the sea. I could see that my hands were very badly burned, and by the feel of my face, I imagined that was too. And when I couldn't see my hands anymore, I knew I'd gone blind.
He was rescued after 3 hours in the sea, and though terribly burnt, he recovered in hospital.
I had a number of plastic operations on my hands and face, including 4 new eyelids, an upper lip, and an eyebrow or 2. They had done a very good job. You forget about it very soon. Forget even when other people don't forget.
His face, despite these ghastly scars, and they were ghastly, was one of the most arresting I've ever seen. Before that, nobody would have looked at him. He was just another pretty boy. Since his injuries, he was completely unforgettable.
It was while he was recovering that he wrote The Last Enemy. It was an immediate success, and he was showered with praise. He toured America for the war effort, but his scarred face was just too much for some people to take. Back in England, against the odds, he eventually found a way back into operational flying.
When he went up for this, if you like to call it medical, some quite elderly doctor said, well, do you want to go back flying? And he said, what was I supposed to say? No, I don't. I'd read it. He said, yes, I do. Okay, you're passing.
I know he was very frightened. Don't ask me to explain why, but I do know that he was very frightened. But he had the courage to do what he was doing, although he was frightened.
Not long afterwards, while training to be a night fighter pilot, he was killed. He was 23 years old.
The pilot's got a unique experience of life which is very close to death. Who should understand that it's a small world if not the pilot, who may someday be flying on world air routes, making it even smaller. I mean, people have talked about schemes to exchange civilian technicians, to send the Welsh miner to Virginia, the Yorkshire farmer to the Middle West. I'd like to see that done, but I'd like to see them send pilots too. They must have a part to play in that, and in the peace.
Richard Hillary was a complex character, outwardly self-assured, inwardly searching for a truth and a meaning in life. He was able to express with remarkable eloquence the unique experience of the world which pilots share. Douglas Bader, another Battle of Britain pilot, had an uncomplicated view of the war and of his own role in it.
Freedom surely is something that you die for, you fight for, you bleed for, you guard. You can't be given freedom, you've got to earn it and fight for it and die for it and keep it.
Bader's view of most issues was clear and simple. Things were either right or they were wrong, black or white. Rarely were there any shades of grey. He had a pugnacious nature which was evident even at school. A fellow pupil at St Edward's School, Oxford, wrote in the school magazine only recently,
"We were in the same house and quite close friends, but though he was 2 years younger, he always dominated every society he was in. He mixed with all kinds, senior and junior, and was always the centre of focus. Everyone admired him. I think that most people liked him, although inevitably at times he was too overbearing."
And Walter Dingwall, who taught him.
I liked his quiet cheek, to start with. in form, but never rode. For all, he was a very good rugger player and cricketer and hockey, where he showed promise both in work and particularly in his games ability, and even at that stage a certain amount of leadership among his compatriots.
While Barder was at St Edward's, his parents found they could no longer afford the fees. Walter Dingwall offered to pay them, and Barder only found out about the arrangement when he broached the subject of going to Cranwell, the Air Force College. His mother then explained the financial situation. He went straight to Walter Dingwall to thank him.
He had once said that he wanted to get into the Air Force and go to Cranwell. And I said, okay, but you must then win a prize cadetship. And if so, I think we could arrange the finance. And from that moment, he started to work rather harder than he'd done before.
Barder went to Cranwell, where life could not have been more fulfilling. He excelled at both flying and sport, and was chosen for the 1931 flying display at Hendon. He was also a probable fly half for England. But the glittering life came to an abrupt end. While doing aerobatics at very low level for a dare, he crashed and narrowly escaped with his life.
I didn't sort of feel anything particularly except pain. Now, many people have said to me, and I'm sure you'll ask me, so I'll tell you before you ask me, that people say, well, wasn't it a great shock to you when you knew you'd lost your legs? And it sounds a ridiculous thing to say, but in fact, I never got to the period of shock because I was far too occupied in the pain when I was conscious, and pain occupies one's mind to the exclusion of almost anything else. And if somebody keeps coming and saying, hello, boy, I say, you've lost a leg, you're not interested in it because all you're concerned about is getting rid of this beastly pain. So by the time I finally had lost my legs and I was fit and getting well again and I hadn't got the pain, I'd become conditioned to this loss of legs.
He was able to prove that he could still fly with his artificial legs, but the Air Force had no place for a legless pilot and he was invalided out. He went to work for Shell Oil in an office. He carved out a new life. He took up golf, which he found he could play even on tin legs. When the war came in 1939, he battled his way back into the RAF and was very soon not only operational, but leading a squadron at the height of the Battle of Britain. He wrote to Walter Dingwall.
I felt in 1933 when the RAF chucked me out that all you'd done for me had been wasted. And it is such a pleasure to me now to know that you can feel that it has not, after all, been of no avail. I must say that getting back into the RAF was a masterpiece of persistence. Aided by some good friends at court and an undisputed ability to fly an aeroplane, I managed to invalid myself back into the RAF, much to my friends' amusement. The beauty of the whole thing is that the Air Ministry, with all their red tape and nonsense, are now in the position of having a pilot in the service who at one and the same time is assessed at 100% disabled and 100% medically fit to fly at home and abroad. They can work that one out at their leisure. I pretty well got back my seniority now, due to a certain amount of luck. I've got a bunch of Canadians who are as wild as hell, but damn good in a scrap, which after all is what they're here for.
Though I have never thought that he regarded war as a game that had to be played, he really did feel that his life had come to some real purpose, and that he was determined to show that he could in fact cope. And that was, I think, the basis. He was in many ways, at the time, a rather simple thinker in that kind of way. I don't think he felt very deeply in things, but he knew exactly the line he wanted to take. And he convinced people by, in many ways, his openness.
You see, there's a good side to war as well as a bad side. The good side is it brings out the best in people. People one would never think one had it in one and so on. But you see, when we were fighting in 1940, particularly when we were alone, everyone was on the same side. We were all on the same side, you and me and the chap who was mending the aeroplane and the bloke who was serving the drink and the chap who was driving the car, the Navy, the Army, everybody was on the same side. We were fighting for us, for our country, for survival virtually. And this is an experience. Now, as soon as you've finished, then you can start having a row with each other. This is the whole point, you see.
Before long, he was leading 5 squadrons in combat, and he had shot down 22 enemy aircraft. But he was shot down himself over France in 1942, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, finishing up in Colditz. After the war, he went back to the Shell Oil Company, and they gave him an aircraft for business, and he took up golf again. Sir Ian Stewart and his wife Anne, who met through Barder, were his close friends.
Typical of him, playing on the 8th hole at St Andrews in the middle, when he was going very well indeed. He got into a little trap in the front, and the obvious thing to do, play back and pitch on the green and get a 4 instead of a 3. I said to Douglas, "Why don't you pitch back?" He said, "I'm never bloody well going backwards." And he hit 6 shots in the trap before he got out and took 8.
You knew, for example, if he came off a golf course, you knew that he was hurting like mad because he'd done a full 18-hole round, and he would never complain, and that taught me how to be a bit more courageous than perhaps I'd ever been. He would always have a joke. He was always laughing, swearing a little, but life was tremendous fun, and you couldn't resist that being fun bit. He loved to be the centre of attraction in a way, I suppose, because he loved other people to know what he thought and how he felt.
Didn't you find this a little bit over-aggressive, shall we say?
Oh, we were always arguing, but it always ended up in a huge ha, 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 which was his great laugh.
Oh yes, he always had a view, black or white, and you went along with it or you disagreed with it, he didn't mind. But he was always a very strong man in expressing his opinions, some of them outrageous. Take Rhodesia, which was one of his great pal was Ian Smith, who flew with him. Ian Smith was his chum. Back your chum's right or wrong, and so Ian Smith was right.
I had the privilege of flying with him several times, and we always had a lot of fun together because he would go through black clouds because he knew I hated them. It was a great experience, and when he got up into the sunshine through the clouds, he was singing and laughing and became that other person without a sort of life below. It was just he was up in the sky where he was the happiest person in the world.
In 1976, he was knighted, not for his war record, but for his work with the disabled. Sir Douglas Barder died in 1982. The 4th pilot in this programme is Leonard Cheshire, who now lives in Suffolk. He was at Oxford University when the war started, and he became a bomber pilot. He was once described as a theological student thinly disguised as a senior officer. That was at the time he took over the RAF's most famous bomber squadron, the Dam Busters.
In 617 Squadron, when I joined it, we had our final objective was to destroy the V3 sites, the new secret weapon which Hitler was building. And these were embedded under 50 foot of reinforced concrete, which no bomb could touch. And Barnes-Wallis had designed a deep penetration bomb called Tallboy, which, if dropped from 16,000 feet within an accuracy of 20 yards, would penetrate 90 foot into the ground and blow it up from underneath. So everything that we did was geared towards using those bombs to destroy the V3. And in order to do that, you had to mark the target precisely. The only way that you can drop a marker within a few yards of your aiming point is low level, or in those days was low level. But you had to do it in a dive, because otherwise the marker wouldn't stick, it might bounce 300 yards. So you had to usually come in low level, get underneath the fences, climb up and identify your aiming point. Once you were certain of your aiming point, put the aircraft down in a steep dive, probably 40 degrees, straight at your aiming point, and release the bomb as low as you could. I like to go straight in as the moment I could see the aiming point, hoping to achieve surprise. But if you fly around too much, thinking how I'm going to get in, you may lose your nerve and never go in at all. Others will do it, but my way was to go in the moment I saw it, even if it meant a much steeper dive than you were supposed to do.
As the war came to a close, he was one of the most experienced bomber leaders in the RAF, and he was sent to witness the dropping of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki.
I have to be truthful and say that my first reaction after seeing that bomb explode was, the war's finished. I think, to be honest, my first reaction was one of relief. Finally, this dreadful experience of 6 years had come to an end. But then the second experience was a realization of what it had meant to those on the ground. But the totality of that war had made such an impact on me. So many people had died, and so few of those that I'd known at flying training school were still alive, that I began to feel the most important thing of all is to try and do something to work against war. There seemed no purpose in the flying. And I think it's true that as human beings, our primary need is to be doing something that has a purpose, and of course a good purpose. I believe that when you're doing a job that you know is worthwhile and that you feel is the job for you, in other words, when you find your niche, if I can put it that way, it's automatically satisfying. And suddenly a door will open and you know that's my door. In my case, the door was an old man dying of cancer whom the hospital couldn't keep, and there was nowhere for him to go. And for want of anything better, I took him into my own house and looked after him. And that led to my work amongst disabled people.
That act of kindness was the start of what is now a worldwide network of Cheshire Homes for the Disabled. His care for others goes hand in hand with his belief in a very personal God.
It was about the end of the war. In fact, shortly before I went out to the Pacific for the atom bomb, but quite suddenly I realized that God existed, something I'd never believed in before. So that there were now two different influences in me. One was the human one of wanting to work for peace, and the other was deciding whether I was really prepared to accept Christianity, because to me it was Christianity that was the human structure within which one built a relationship with God. I think we have to take human nature as it is. We have to be realistic about what is in man, the good as well as the bad. I think there's a great danger in expecting too much of any good work that we do. I don't believe that there's any substitute for advancing step by step, little by little. To me, the most important thing of all is keeping going. I think the most difficult thing in life is finishing. You can go 3/4 of the way flat out, but the point is, can you finish?
Leonard Cheshire, one of the pilots who survived the Second World War. By 1945, the shape and sound of aircraft had changed yet again. Jet aircraft were already in operation, and the task now for pilots was to use all the knowledge and skill they'd gained in the war in the cause of peace.
The Spirits of Kitty Hawk was written and presented by Ivan Rendell. The program... We present The Spirit of Kitty Hawk, 6 programs to mark the 80th anniversary of powered flight. In telling the story of some of the people who've made aviation history, Ivan Rendell today covers the years after the Second World War, the early jet age, when the goal was to fly higher and faster.
Towards the end of the Second World War, the jet engine had arrived, and aircraft began to sound very different. Jet propulsion opened up completely new horizons of height and speed, and just over 40 years after the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk, pilots were challenging the so-called sound barrier. It was an American test pilot, Charles Yeager, who first flew faster than sound, and he made the first sonic boom in 1947.
Being a research test pilot is the ultimate. Research is something that only the very, very best get to do. You're doing something, that every flight is into an area where nothing is known about. And I absolutely gave no thought whatsoever during all of this build-up to Mach 1 of ever worrying about the outcome, because you become a fatalist. You don't give any thought to the outcome, because that detracts from your capability to do very precise, good flying.
Chuck Yeager is still flying supersonically today, and we'll hear more from him later in the program. In Britain, we were just as keen to go supersonic. An ex-RAF pilot named John Derry was working for de Havilland, one of the leading aircraft manufacturers of the day, and he was gradually building up toward that speed in the de Havilland 108. In April 1948, he attempted the 100-kilometre speed record.
Well, here comes John Derry now, bringing the split-back-wing DH-108 into the starting line. He's now disappeared from sight into the haze. Visibility isn't too good, and it should be about 6 minutes before he comes back here to the finishing line. Oh, we waited until suddenly from the western setting sun, the 108 danced up again. Well, a few seconds later, General Loughborough announced 605.230, and there was a whoo from the crowd here. And subject to confirmation, tall, fair-haired, 26-year-old former fighter pilot, squadron leader John Derry is now the new 100-kilometre record holder.
John Derry was one of the top British test pilots of that period. Later that same year, he took the 108 past the speed of sound in a screaming dive.
Naturally, on these occasions, one's always a bit excited or fairly anxious to know what is going to occur. But in the actual behavior of the airplane, it puts no undue physical strain on you because you're flying at the speed of sound.
4 years later, John Derry was at the Farnborough Air Show with another de Havilland aircraft, the DH-110. He described the sensation of supersonic flight at the time.
There are no physical sensations. The only way one can tell one's speed is from the instruments, but in the region of the speed of sound, before you reach it, and up to the speed of sound, there are changes in the control and stability characteristics of the aeroplane, but on the latest aircraft, nothing violent, and there is no way of really telling when you've actually passed through the speed of sound. When you're beyond the speed of sound, it's noticeably smoother.
Shortly after, at the same show, John Derry was killed when his aircraft broke up in the air above the crowd, killing several spectators. But the sight and sound of supersonic aircraft became a big attraction at Farnborough, and huge crowds came to see Neville Duke flying another of Britain's fighters, the Hawker Hunter.
And now Neville Duke comes over in slow inverted flight. A superbly executed slow roll, the slowest of slow rolls, which started away down at the far end of the runway, more than 1.5 miles away, and he recovered onto an even plane at this end of the runway. And now he opens the power as he climbs up now to something like 3,000 feet, flashing away there against a background of broken cumulus clouds, and now coming down for yet another high-speed run past the director's tent at Farnborough. Up goes the nose. Over he goes. One roll, two rolls, and at the second roll he just disappears, cleaves his way through the grey, broken cloud, and now he's away up above it somewhere in the realms of the everlasting sunshine, somewhere around 15,000 feet or possibly even more.
One of the greatest experiences, I personally think, is taking a machine like the Hunter up to a high altitude of over 40,000 feet to carry out one of these high-speed dives which exceeds the speed of sound, because at that height in the clear blue sky, which is almost black by that time, rolling over and pulling through, dropping the nose of the Hunter straight down to the ground gives you quite a sensation of speed as you hang forward on the straps in the dive, which is probably in excess of 45 degrees. And as the indicated speed builds up, so does the Mach number, and by the time you are well, on the way downhill, you'll be at supersonic speed in quite a short time.
Military projects had a high priority, but there was also great competition to produce the first civil jet aircraft. Britain's front runner was the Comet, and the test pilot most closely associated with its development is John Cunningham.
And now flying over the British jet airliner, the Comet, flown by John Cunningham. An aeroplane of considerable potentiality for export sales, which is the thing that really registers these days. A fine aeroplane in BOAC colours, flying now. Beautifully slim silhouette, quiet whisper. If jet aircraft of the future are going to be no more noisy than the Comet, I don't think there are going to be any airport problems. And Johnny Cunningham pulling her away now, showing off her graceful silhouette to the best advantage against the clouds of this September afternoon.
John Cunningham, Neville Duke and John Derry, just three of Britain's pioneering test pilots in that post-war surge in aircraft development. John Cunningham, with over 40 years of experience, knows what it takes to make test pilots.
First of all, good pilots, stable people, preferably a background of engineering, aeronautical engineering if possible. You also have to have a pretty good understanding of basic aeroplanes and aeronautics and what you're trying to do and the limitations on what your aeroplane might be able to do. And I think you've got to realize that everything has to be done carefully, thought about and discussed, and that there is no quick way to achieving any particular objective. It's usually a long, slow and step-by-step grind.
For John Cunningham, who spent 32 years as chief test pilot at de Havilland's, interest in flying started early.
I was always interested in aeroplanes and would I used to get shouted at by the master at my prep school for gazing out of the window at any aeroplane that happened to go by. And I used to build model aeroplanes, flying ones, so that I began to learn something about how aeroplanes flew.
When he left school, he enrolled at the de Havilland Aeronautical Technical School. At the same time, he was learning to fly with the Auxiliary Air Force and was mobilized with them in 1939. He was known in the war as Cat's Eyes Cunningham because of his skill as a night fighter pilot, but the nickname was really a cover for his use of radar in tracking enemy aircraft at night. He shot down 20. After the war, he went back to de Havilland's to work on jets. Did the idea of jet engines excite you?
Oh, enormously, because I had had the pleasure of flying a jet in 1944 and assessing the Vampire, in fact, as a possibility for a night fighter aircraft. And it was such a completely new departure from the old propeller aeroplane that I was tremendously impressed by it.
Is development somehow really what's in your heart in flying?
Well, I've always found it the most interesting side of flying, and it's a challenge, and it needs all the energy, brain power, and skills that one can muster, and determination.
Is there an element, though, of the explorer, in a sense, in it? Are you really sort of looking into the unknown a little, and does that give you an excitement and a thrill?
Yes, I think it does. One realizes that you've got possibilities in your hands, which, if developed sensibly, might be of immense use in the future.
In 1948, he set up a new altitude record of over 59,000 feet in a de Havilland Vampire. But his most productive work was on the new civil project, the Comet, in which he made the first test flights in 1949.
Now, here she is, this beautifully shaped swept-back wing, 450-mile-an-hour British Challenger for world airline supremacy, taking off in the hands of test pilot John Cunningham. was gone, and with a swoosh she came back, flashing past the control tower like a fighter.
I'm coming in now.
Not long after, Cunningham and the Comet were flying 7 miles high at 35,000 feet, the Comet's first visit to the heights at which she will later cruise with 36 passengers on Empire routes. Cunningham, 5 miles above the highest cloud in today's summer sky, 10,000 feet higher than any airliner has yet reached, called us up on his radio telephone.
The Havilland Comet to radio newsreel. I'm now flying at 35,000 feet, the height slightly less than that at which passengers will usually be carried. We're at the moment low cruising power on our 4 Ghost engines, flying at about 400 miles an hour. This is the first time that the Comet's been up to this height, and as we have not yet had the pressurization working in flight, we are breathing oxygen. When the aircraft carries passengers, pressurization should allow them to fly at this height without using oxygen in reasonable ground level comfort. One of our next jobs is to get this pressurization system working, and I think we've got something fairly good in the Comet.
3 years later, the Comet was the first pure jet aircraft to go into commercial service anywhere in the world.
Here is an announcement for passengers on BAC Comet flight 113 to Rome, Beirut, Khartoum, Entebbe, Livingstone and Johannesburg. Will you please take leave of your friends, collect your hand baggage, have your passports ready, and follow the green light through to customs and immigration.
What did you feel when it actually went into passenger service the first time? Here was Britain really ahead of the world.
Well, it was a marvellous thrill, really, to observe the first passenger-carrying service go off from London Airport. I went over there to say farewell to the initial flight, and although I had flown these Comets up and down on development flying and up and down Africa on route proving flights prior to the passenger flights, I still got a tremendous thrill from watching the first passenger departure from London.
And for a number of years, the Comet really flew the flag and flew it extremely well.
Yes, it did. It set the tone, really, for what are now today's run-of-the-mill jet transport.
But in 1953 and 1954, disaster struck.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the 8 o'clock news for today, Sunday the 3rd of May. The Comet jet airliner, overdue while flying from Calcutta to Delhi on its way to London, has been located from the air 20 miles northwest of Calcutta. A ground rescue party is on its way to the spot. It is not yet known if there are any survivors.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the 6 o'clock news for today, Sunday the 10th of January. Half an hour ago, British Overseas Airways issued this statement. BOAC regret to announce that a Comet airliner, operating the service from Singapore to London, came down in the Mediterranean this morning between the islands of Monte Cristo and Elba. There were 29 passengers and a crew of 6 on board. It is not known how many survivors there are.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the 7 o'clock news for today, Friday the 9th of April. A BOAC Comet airliner which left London on Wednesday is missing on a flight to Johannesburg. The chairman of BOAC, Sir Miles Thomas, has ordered the suspension of all the corporation's Comet services.
The Comets remained out of service for 4 years. It was a disaster for British aviation, for the company, and for Sir Geoffrey de Havilland himself, who had been one of Britain's earliest pioneers. Tests eventually showed that the problem lay in the stresses caused by cabin pressurization. John Cunningham's own feelings reflect the mood at the Hatfield factory where the Comet was built and tested.
Very sad that there clearly was some major failure, but in no way did it shake our conviction that we had got the right sort of ideas about transport, jet transport in particular. and we were desperately keen to find out where the failure had occurred. We at Hatfield were pioneering with the Comet, jet transport, and we had these failures which most likely would have occurred to anyone else who set off, as we did, pioneering. Sir Geoffrey, in his long life with aeroplanes, had had many disappointments, and he was a pioneer in many ways, and he said so wisely that that is sometimes the cost of pioneering, that the idea is developed, but that other people benefit by the efforts of the pioneer.
The Comet crashes occurred in commercial service, with fare-paying passengers being killed. For the test pilot, the risk of death is part of the job. Right back in 1946, Sir Geoffrey de Havilland's own son, Geoffrey, had been killed on a test flight. His de Havilland 108 broke up in the air. At that time, there was intense competition to be first to fly faster than sound, and pilots accepted that risks had to be taken.
Sadly, when you are going into new areas, as he was, of high Mach number and high speed, there are risks, and one learns that you can really only advance by very small steps. And subsequently, when we'd rebuilt or built a new aeroplane similar to the one he was killed in, and went through step by step, but with much smaller steps, the flight path of his aircraft, we established conclusively why his aeroplane failed.
In America, the Geoffrey de Havilland crash was a great lesson. Chuck Yeager, the pilot whom we heard at the beginning of the program, was given very clear orders by the man in charge of the American flight test program, Colonel Al Boyd.
He was very specific that we not have accidents because, see, Great Britain was going through a real trauma in research flying with the loss of the DH-108 de Havilland Swallows, and we'd watched this program, and when they busted their ass over there, or busted their tail with the DH-108, and it really hurt them for many, many years in aerodynamic development. And that was one specific thing that he was adamant about, that says that nothing happened to that program.
The American aircraft, the rocket-powered Bell X-1, was very different from the DH-108. It was carried up to 26,000 feet in the belly of a B-29 bomber and dropped, like a bomb, before the pilot lit up the rockets. By 1947, Chuck Yeager had made many such flights, each time edging closer towards Mach 1, the speed of sound.
This flight that occurred on October the 14th, I had no idea we were going to break Mach 1, and no one else did either. And the thing just went as all flights had. The only problem, I was really in pain because this flight was on Tuesday morning, and Sunday night, Glennis and I were out riding horses after dinner at Poncho's, the Dude Ranch out there. I ran into a fence with a horse at night going wide open, and which threw me a long way through the air, and I landed on my right side and busted a couple ribs. And I was actually a little bit hurting, but I had checked the system out and found out that I could close the door, and flying with taped up broken ribs really didn't make much difference in the X-1 anyway, because you don't do an awful lot of work when you fly airplanes. I mean, strenuous work. And that flight just went as all the rest, and the only thing that really surprised me was sitting there looking at 965, all once the Mach meter fluctuated and went off the scale, which extrapolated to about 1.06. And at that point, all the buffeting quit. I got back a little bit of elevator effectiveness, and I was amazed that the thing had worked out that way. And I sat there for about 20 seconds above Mach 1, and then shut it off, came back through the buffeting, and came down and landed. And really my feeling was, man, I'm really glad it's over with.
How did you feel inside there yourself?
I had a feeling of satisfaction, obviously. When I came down, I said, well, we've hacked it. We've done what we're supposed to do.
Chuck Yeager is the very essence of the all-American test pilot. He's aggressive, a pusher and shover, full of get-up and go, and a superb pilot. All the qualities which Tom Wolfe has called the right stuff. When he met me at Sacramento Airport, he came bounding across the arrival hall with the words, "I can tell a dour-looking Englishman at over 100 yards. He has a permanent smile, twinkling eyes, and exudes a great sense of fun and energy. At the age of 60, he's still flying supersonic aircraft." He told me the story of how he came to be a top research test pilot, beginning in a small village in West Virginia.
I had a typical rural type raising, we call it. I milked cows, farmed. I never saw an airplane on the ground until I was about 15 years old and never had anything to do with airplanes. But in June 1941, at the age of 18, since the war was pretty well raging in Europe at that time and we were mobilizing, the thing to do was to enlist in the service. And I picked the Air Force primarily because the recruiting officer for the Air Force I liked better than I did the Army or the Navy. And I enlisted in the Air Force as a private. I had no intention to fly airplanes. I knew nothing about airplanes, and as I mentioned, I'd never seen an airplane on the ground until I was about 15. I'd never ridden in one, never even been close to them. Because really, flying, when we were raised back in the mountains, didn't mean an awful lot. I just thought it'd be a hell of a good way to get from one mountaintop to another without going down and climbing back up. But airplanes to me were entirely foreign.
Did you take to it very easily once you actually got airborne?
I got a little sick. Well, actually, it was amusing. When I was crew chief on the AT-11s, my engineering officer asked me if I wanted to go ride in one on my airplane after working on it. I said yes, and he took me up, and it was a hot, day in the desert and rough, and I remember I got violently sick, and I thought there's not a hell of a lot of future in flying airplanes, but I got sick. I heaved my cookies all over my airplane, and I was really miserable. But then when I started flying the airplane myself, it worked real good. To me, there's no such thing as a natural-born pilot. It's a matter of experience, and in fact, when we were in basic, I was cautioned 2 or 3 times on my attitude because basically I was probably a little bit cocky. And the reason I was cocky was that I was a corporal, under the flying sergeant program, and we were outnumbered about 5 to 1 by aviation cadets. And our attitude was probably a little bit cockier, at least mine was, because I just looked at it as, I was as good as anybody, and I could care less whether I was an enlisted man or a cadet. And I was cautioned 2 or 3 times, but when it came to flying ability, I probably was an average pilot.
At what point did you actually begin, if I can put it this way, to fall in love with flying?
I don't think I ever did get hooked on flying. In fact, like I use the expression today, I wouldn't pay a nickel to fly an airplane because I've flown the best, of course. And I liked the lifestyle. It was, it was fun and it was competitive. But just to go fly in an airplane, I never did get hooked on it. It was a lot of work, and and it was noisy, but the fun was doing a good job with an airplane.
And flying was something he did know about. During the war, Yeager had flown fighters in combat in Europe. He was shot down over France, but escaped through Spain to fly again. Back home, he asked to be posted to Wright-Patterson Airfield, America's main flight test base.
They assigned me as the assistant maintenance officer in the fighter test section of the flight test division. And here's 2 hangars full of World War II fighters. And there I was with the job of running functional flight tests on all of these airplanes when they came out of maintenance. And I was in hog heaven. Got all these airplanes, and all I did was fly them, and it was fun. And then I began to put on air shows with the jets. Because when you live and breathe air combat tactics or dogfighting, you get pretty good with an airplane. It's just natural. You get a lot of experience, and you shine your fanny a lot, doing rolls off the deck and looping and things like that. And so I used to put on air shows at Wright Field in the P-80s.
Then came his big break. He was selected for training as a test pilot.
I had trouble in the academics because I didn't have enough of an academic background, and most pilots had degrees who went into flight tests, and I only had a high school education. Really, I think the reason he selected me was because of my maintenance background. I understood systems, and I was pretty well disciplined. I did what I was told, and I was aggressive, and had a good combat record, and a lot of experience. So that had a lot to do with it. Also, the way I flew airplanes, air show work, I didn't do it haphazardly. I was pretty precise, and I did it exactly the way it should be done, and all those things added up probably, and my personality see, research flying it's very demanding, and it's competitive, and it's obviously dangerous.
Is it lonely?
No, you don't look at it that way. See, you don't do anything without an airplane, and an airplane doesn't do anything without you. It's a lot of teamwork between you and your airplane, but it's competitive amongst pilots.
During our interview, despite all the conversation about test flying, there was one theme that General Charles Yeager frequently came back to.
Combat now to me, is the ultimate in flying. That's the reason you're trained, and that's the reason you're put on Earth and given an airplane, is to fight with. And that's the way I always felt. And that attitude carried over into research flying, because research flying and combat are very similar, because you really don't know the outcome. You know, it's not predictable, especially when you're doing research in an unknown region. And that same attitude, the only way you can describe it is probably you become a fatalist. You don't think about the outcome. See, that's the farthest thing from your mind. The object is to survive.
Like all the people I've talked about in these programs, the early jet pilots of the 40s and 50s were flying at the very frontiers of aeronautical knowledge. In the late 50s, those frontiers moved outside the atmosphere into space with the launch of the first man-made satellite, the Russian Sputnik 1. Once again, a new sound heralded a new age, the age of the astronaut.
The Spirit of Kitty Hawk was written and presented by Ivan Rendell. The program included recordings from the BBC's Sound